By the time that the sun rose next morning, Ealdred and Ige were 4 leagues closer to Fari, and confident that there was no pursuit to their rear. They had lost their second horse, but Ealdred's massive war-horse, Hengustir, whom he had named after the fabled charger of the legendary Phaidon in the time before the Well of Magan gave birth to the human race, was so powerful that Ige's diminutive weight on his haunches made little difference to him. The girl rode with her arms holding her man around his narrow waist, and her head snuggled up against him. The beckoning seduction of the aroma of the ocean was carried to them on a stiff sea breeze. It was the first time that Ige had been anywhere near a sea, and although the ditch was hardly much for the Anglian to get excited about, the smell of the salt intrigued the Oriental, and she kept sniffing the air in an affected manner, as if to comment on the strangeness of this foreign shore, where even the air smelt different. After a while they passed through the small town of Bindji, where the strangeness was more repellent and more disturbing. It took the form of a Gathkari male pulling a cart of offal and dung. The job of removing animal waste to the cesspit in a hand-cart was a task so disgusting that it had been made a penalty for a certain level of criminal offence. Instead of the punishment of imprisonment or being set in the public stocks for civic revenge, miscreants were made to perform a sentence of service to the community in the form of the most dishonourable and degrading municipal employments. Under the matriarchal hierarchy of values imposed upon the faithful, these humiliations were believed to be the humane option. Men all over the country were consigned to this fate. This wretched creature in Bindji was one such. Around his neck was hung a placard which announced his crime: insulting language to our honoured guests. He had spoken to a foreigner in a way that they had deemed to be discourteous or offensive. It was the most commonplace of crimes these days. Almost every Gathkari male fell foul of it sooner or later. Neither Ealdred nor Ige could read in any language, so they could only guess at what the arcane scribbling on the placard might portend. But what struck them most forcefully was that the fellow was not chained to his cart, nor was anyone supervising his grotesquely filthy work. He performed his allotted task of his own volition, and willingly applied himself in a genuine desire to atone for his sin, believing himself to be guilty as charged, and fully deserving of the treatment that he was required to suffer. He felt his own shameful guilt so keenly that, enslaved beast of burden that he was also his own jailer. The banal yet unanswerable reason for the way that the men of Gathkar tolerated and endorsed their own oppression was that their religious faith required them to. They were sincere believers in the absolute rule of the lunar goddess of Mwanamamaku, as translated to this earthly dimension by the priestesses of Atamis, the many-breasted. As men, it was a necessary act of faith to surrender themselves to a social order which treated them as deficient because they were deviant from the female. They did not resent this, but merely wished to feminize themselves as completely as possible, so as to draw closer to the sublime divinity inherent in the feminine. Ealdred had once been told that near the geographical centre of Gathkar was a large and inexplicably mysterious body of water called Jarin, the Salt Lake. The word Jarin meant tears, and the lake was said by political dissidents who did not believe in the doctrines of Mwanamamaku to be the repository of all the salt tears shed by the men of Gathkar since their fall from grace. It had seemed to Ealdred, when he heard this dissident's fable, that the Gathkaris should have shed tears of blood, but if they must weep a lake of water, then they should have been quick to drown their matriarchal rulers in it. But now that he had returned to this benighted country, it was painfully obvious to him that the men of Gathkar were far too steeped in the self-contempt that consumed their ideologically conditioned souls, ever to rise up against the women who ruled them with this nonsensical mysticism. The web of cultural constraints that bound the men made it psychologically impossible for such subjugated beasts to stand up and answer back, or slit the throats of their oppressors. It became increasingly apparent to Ealdred, as he and his companion continued on their way south, that the political nightmare which he had witnessed on his previous visit more than a decade ago had gotten a great deal worse in the years since. It was difficult to credit that devotion to a religious doctrine could possibly cause anyone to permit themselves to be used in the manner in which the men of Gathkar were treated. Their lives were far worse even than those of slaves, for at least a slave can hate his oppressor and dream of freedom, whereas the men of Gathkar were required by their ideology to be complicit in their own humiliation, to endorse and approve their own disgrace. At a tavern in a small seaside village, Ealdred came upon a Vespaean mercenary archer called Conrad, who had become almost as displaced and far from home as the Anglian was. The Vespaean, a beefy, fair-haired fellow of about 30, with a deep scar that ran laterally across his forehead, had been in this part of the world for some time, plying his trade with his beautifully crafted recurve bow, 70 inches of laminated yew and hickory, the flexible wood kept polished and free from scratches, although the archer himself was rather dusty and threadbare. The two men, both professional soldiers for hire, were natural comrades, despite the hostility that existed between their ethnic nations, and they conversed in Gelton all evening over tankards of the weak Gathkari ale, which was all that the inns and hostelries hereabouts could offer, with Ige taking no part in the conversation, but curled up cosily like a cat on the tavern bench, with her head resting in her effendi's lap, listening to the peculiar words and sounds of the Gelton language. Conrad was actually travelling up from the south, where he had been treasure-seeking in the lands of the Bantu, the tribal kingdoms of Negro peoples that extended beyond the cartography of map-makers into unknown jungles. Conrad had spent the past year in the tribal lands between the Bayesic Sea and the unscalable range of mountains called the Ogli Barrier, the highest peaks in the world, the mountains of God that no man had ever climbed. He said that there were tribal chiefs down there who had extraordinary wealth in gold body ornamentations and jewelry. Conrad claimed to have met one who had golden teeth, that the fellow had lost his natural teeth, and so had them replaced by evenly moulded little blocks of gold of the appropriate size and shape. But for all his talk of treasure, Conrad did not appear too prosperous himself at present. He was heading back home to the fiefdom of Vespaean. Conrad found the Gathkari attitude to foreigners like himself a great joke. He had benefited from it many a time, he freely confessed. As honoured guests in Gathkar, the ruling caste of Matriarchs had never presumed to impose upon foreigners the cripplingly oppressive laws that imprisoned the lives of Gathkari males. Consequently, foreigners could largely commit crimes with impunity, a political situation which had created a thriving Bantu and Telitsim criminal class, characteristically arrogant and swaggering and well used to violating the locals pretty much as it took their fancy, with no fear of retribution. The imperious Akrani, of course, were worse still. For this reason, although the matriarchy brought in harsher and harsher penalties for wrongdoers, these seldom applied in practice, because those who were committing the crimes were exempt.